Hello everyone, welcome to Food Microbiology lecture series. In today's deliberation, we will be having a discussion on the spoilage of meat as well as meat product. Let us begin the lecture by understanding the composition of the meat. So coming to the composition of the meat, herein I have established a table which gives you a brief composition of the individual constituents that might be present in case of meat. So first then we have the moisture content. So the moisture content in case of meat is 70%. So that means that the water activity of the meat will be extremely high. So if the water activity of the meat is high, it means that it is in turn facilitates the microbial growth. So the microorganism will in turn be able to grow, multiply and bring in a lot of spoilage characteristic in case of meat as well as meat product. So following which it is the protein. So the protein is 20% in case of meat, and that is the reason it is regarded as the protein rich food product. Okay, so coming to the fat, it ranges anywhere between 7 to 14% and the pH of the meat is anywhere between 6.5 to 7 in that particular range. So which effectively ensures that mostly neutrophiles will be able to grow, proliferate, multiply and then bring in the lot of spoilage characteristic in case of meat. So this is the brief composition of the meat as well as meat product, and it is regarded as a highly perishable food product because of the higher amount of moisture content that is persisting in case of the fresh meat. Okay, so this was about the brief introduction about the meat. So let us now understand what is the possible microflora that exists in case of meat as well as meat product. So in case of freshly cut meat, so the possible microflora could be the bacteria, yeast as well as mold. Okay, so irrespective whether they are spoilage causing or they are pathogenic microflora. So the bacteria in case of meat could be the lactobacillus species as well as other lactic acid bacterial species, and also Acinetobacter, Bacillus, Micrococcus, Serratia as well as Staphylococcus. So these are the variety of bacteria which are spoilage causing as well as pathogenic by nature. Okay, so next then we have the fungi, which includes both yeast as well as mold. When we are talking about the mold, it is the Aspergillus species, the Penicillium species, Rhizopus as well as Thamnidium. So these are the most predominant type of mold that might actually exist in case of freshly cut meat. And also when we are talking about the yeast, it can be the Dabaromyces species, Torula species, Torulopsis, and then Trichonosporium as well as Candida. So these are the predominant species of yeast which might actually exist in case of freshly cut meat as well as meat product. So how exactly such kind of microorganism seeks an entry into the meat as well as meat product? So there are variety of sources of contamination which in turn leads or provides a way for such kind of microorganism to seek an entrance into the meat as well as meat product. So let us now understand what are the possible sources of contamination which in turn is leading to the spoilage of the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the first thing, let us understand what are the possible sources of contamination. So the sources of contamination of the meat can come from the animal itself, it can come from the type of water that is being used in the meat industry, and also the aerial microflora which might be present, and also the contamination which might occur during processing as well as handling of the meat as well as meat products. So let us understand individual contamination one by one. So first then we have animal as a possible source of contamination of the meat. Okay, so from an animal, the contamination can actually come from the surface flora. So because the surface of an animal is one of the possible or the prominent sources of contamination of microorganism, possible source of contamination of food product. Okay, so the flora of the respiratory tract and also the flora of the gastrointestinal tract, that is nothing but GIT. So the gastrointestinal tract, if harbors a lot of species which can be pathogenic as well as spoilage causing. So the contamination of the meat by the gastrointestinal species in turn results in the spoilage of meat as well as meat product. So besides that, the contamination might also come from the hides, the hooves of an animal, and also the hair. So the hair of an animal can also harbor a lot of microorganism. So that is the reason why it is always advisable that the animal has to be given a proper bathing prior to the slaughtering, thus ensuring that the amount of the possible sources on the external surface will be effectively reduced. Okay, so whenever we are talking about the poultry, so the contamination in case of the poultry can come from the feathers, the feet, etc. So because the feet harbors a lot of contamination and it is known to contaminate the entire carcass with a possible pathogenic microflora. Okay, so besides that, the skin of the animal might contain the possible microorganisms such as like micrococci, staphylococci, and then beta hemolytic streptococci. So these are the possible sources of microorganism which can actually come from an animal itself. So animal is one of the primary source of contamination of the meat as well as meat product. So this was about the animal. So next thing we have water. So water is one of the major ingredient which is effectively used in case of meat as well as meat industry. Besides using for the cleaning of the floor, it can also be used for the cleaning and sanitation of the meat as well, because hot water as well as the steam is effectively used for cleaning as well as sanitization of the meat equipment and also the carcass. So if it is not properly taken care, for example, if the water that is being used for cleaning as well as the sanitation of the meat equipment is not properly sterilized or chlorinated, then it might lead a way to different sources of contamination which might actually come from the natural aquatics. So natural aquatic is the water source itself has the natural microflora such as like Pseudomonas and then cyanobacteria, E. coli, the Salmonella, Shigella as well as Vibrio. So these are the natural microorganism which is present in case of the water source. Okay, so next in the soil dwelling. So soil dwelling is the type of microorganism which have sought an entry into the water via the washed soil. Okay, so they can be Bacillus, Clostridium, Acetobacter as well as alkali genes. Okay, so next then we have the intestinal microflora. So the intestinal microflora is something such as like coliforms, Salmonella as well as Shigella. So these are the possible intestinal microflora which soughts an entry into the water if it is not properly disinfected or chlorinated. Okay, so this was about the water as a possible source of contamination of meat as well as meat products. So next then we have another important source, that is air. So as we are already aware, so air do not harbor any kind of a microorganism naturally because it is not a natural medium for the growth and multiplication of microorganism as it doesn't provide any kind of a food for the microorganism. So the dust as well as the dirt particle might be the potential source of carrier of microorganism which in turn persists in the environment, because in the dust and dirt particle there will be a possible biological sources of contaminants such as like the cells, the animal hairs, and then pollen, and then algae, protozoa, bacteria, yeast and mold, as well as other spore and non-spore forming bacteria. So they might persist or they might be present on the surface or adhered onto the dust as well as the dirt, and whenever such kind of dust and dirt particle is landing onto the meat surface, in turn it will contaminate the entire carcass and leading to the spoilage of meat as well as meat product. So air can also be a potential source of contamination of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so next then we have the contamination which might actually come during the handling as well as processing of the meat as well as meat product. So whenever we are discussing this, it is of important concern that we also have a idea about the processing equipment as a potential source, because the processing equipment such as like the meat slicer which is effectively shown in this picture if it is not properly sanitized or cleaned after every operation, then the kind of contamination will be transmitted to the another lot of meat which is subjected for slicing in the meat cutter. So it has to be effectively taken care that after every operation of any of the food processing equipment, it needs to sanitation as well as sterilization. And the second kind of contamination can come from ingredients as well. So the type of ingredients that is being used for processing of meat into different products. Okay, so that can also lead to possible source of contamination as well. So next is product to product, which is nothing but the cross contamination. So whenever a processed product is packaged, it will never be in contact with an unprocessed food product. Why? Because the unprocessed food product harbors a lot of microorganisms, which in turn might be transmitted to the processed food variety and in turn leads to the cross contamination. Okay, so finally we have packaging material. So if the packaging material is not properly sanitized or sterilized, then it might actually lead to the potential source of contamination of the processed food variety. Okay, so that is the reason why it is of utmost important that whenever an individual who is in direct contact with the food matrix also should need to be properly dressed. When I say properly dressed, it means that he or she has to wear a proper neat clothing, and also they need to wear a hand gloves so that if the potential source of contamination from the surface of the skin can be avoided, in turn transmitted into the food matrix. Okay, so that was about the handling as well as processing of food product. Okay, so next then let us have an understanding on what kind of preservation technique can be implemented so that the potential sources as well as the spoilage of the food product can be effectively taken care. So the first then we have asepsis. So as we are already aware, asepsis is nothing but keeping away the microorganisms. So how exactly asepsis plays an important role in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the asepsis or keeping of microorganism away from the meat as much as practical possible during the slaughtering as well as handling of the meat as well as meat product. So during or prior to the slaughtering or during the slaughtering and after the slaughtering where a various processing activity involves. So we will have to ensure that we are keeping away the microorganisms. So how exactly it can be ensured? By making sure that the animal is given a proper bathing. So herein you can actually see in this particular picture an animal is being properly cleaned prior to the slaughtering. So whenever an animal is subjected for cleaning prior to the slaughtering, it ensures that whatever the surface flora, as we studied previously in the contamination, that the surface or the skin of an animal harbors a lot of microorganisms. So the lot of microorganism can actually come from the skin, or it comes from the hair, or it might come from the foot, etc. So depending on what type of animal is subjected for slaughtering, so we will have to ensure that the animal has to be given a proper bathing, thus ensuring that the surface flora of the microorganism, the surface flora of an animal is effectively taken care. Okay, so that is the reason why an animal needs a proper bathing prior to the slaughtering. Okay. So the next important preservation technique that can be employed to extend the shelf life of the meat as well as meat product is freezing. So freezing is a technique which is often used to preserve the meat, wherein the meat has to be transported to a longer distances. Okay, so herein the meat as well as the meat carcass will be frozen to a temperature ranging anywhere between -12.2 to -28.9 degree centigrade. So that is the temperature that has to be effectively maintained to ensure that the product is effectively frozen so that it can be transported through a longer distance. Okay, so that was one of the important other technique, that is freezing. Okay. Another important point that has to be effectively remembered in here is whenever we are subjecting the meat as well as the meat product for freezing, which is as low as -30 degrees centigrade, so it will ensure that no microorganism is actually being grown. Okay, so the microorganism will not be able to grow and bring in any kind of a spoilage characteristic. Okay, therefore freezing can be an effective method which could be employed to extend the shelf life of the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so that was about the freezing. So the next type of important technique that can be employed to extend the shelf life is drying. So what exactly happens in drying? So drying is nothing but to reduce the available moisture content. So when the moisture content in case of meat is reduced, that means in turn the water activity will also be reduced. So when the water activity of the meat is reduced, it means that it is ensuring that there is no microorganism will be growing, and in turn it will not bring about any kind of a possible spoilage changes in case of meat as well as meat product. But it is mostly followed in case of traditional way. So there are no commercial available dried meat product available. So it is mostly the traditional method which is ensured by sun drying. Okay, so the most traditional way is sun drying, but there are no commercial product as such available in the market where the meat as well as the meat carcass will be in the dried form. Okay, so that was about the drying. So one thing that has to be remembered here is the drying will ensure or effectively bring down the available moisture content as well as the water activity, thus ensuring that there is no microbial growth as well as survival in the meat as well as meat product. So this was about the drying as an important technique. So the next thing we have salting. So salting is also one of the important preservative technique that is employed to increase the shelf life and check on the growth of microorganisms. So one of the major use of salting is to bring in the preservative action, and also it can be used as a flavoring agent. So it can be used as a flavoring agent, and also in addition to that it will bring in the preservative action as well. Okay, so the primary purpose of this is to lower the water activity. So how exactly it is lowering? So how exactly it is bringing in the preservative effect? So this is via a method process called as plasmolysis. So imagine we have a bacterial cell in here. Okay, so in case of isotonic solution, everything is properly balanced. That means there is no migration of moisture from inside of the bacterial or microorganism cell to the outside environment, because the solution is isotonic and everything is in balance. So had it been we have higher amount of salt content, so which is resulting in the hypertonic solution via the process of osmosis, that is movement of water from higher concentration to the lower concentration. So higher concentration is present inside the cell of the microorganism. So that is the reason the moisture will migrate all the way from the inside of the cell of the microorganism to the outside environment, which is hypertonic by nature. So thus it will lead to the lysis of the bacterial cell, and the process is regarded as plasmolysis. So this is the mechanism of action of salt against microorganism, thereby bringing in the preservative effect. Okay, so that was about salt to be used or being used as a important preservation technique. So next then we have chemical preservatives. So the chemical preservative includes the addition of numerous variety of chemical ingredients. Okay, so whenever we are adding chemical preservatives, they are giving us two distinct operations. So that is that they can be bactericidal or they can be bacteriostatic. So whenever we are telling it is a bactericidal, it means that it is leading to the lysis or killing of microorganisms. So by the addition of chemical preservative, if they are bactericidal, they are killing the microorganism. If it is bacteriostatic, it means it is stopping the growth of the microorganism. So these are the two important functions which are brought in by the addition of the chemical preservatives. So the most important type of chemical preservatives that are being added for meat as well as meat product are nitrites as well as nitrates. So one of the important characteristic of these chemical preservatives is that they must be GRAS, which is nothing but generally recognized as safe. Generally recognized as safe. So whatever be the chemical preservative that is being added, so one has to ensure that they are generally recognized as safe and do not pose any kind of a threat to the consumer. Okay, so that was important characteristics. So moving on, let us have an understanding on what kind of chemical preservatives are effectively being used. So as I've already told, it is nitrates as well as nitrites which are predominant. So nitrates as well as nitrites not only help bacteria, but also not only help to kill the bacteria, but also produce a characteristic flavor and gives the meat a pink or red color. So that was one of the important characteristic of using such kind of preservatives, such as like nitrites as well as nitrates. So whenever we are using nitrates as well as nitrites, they will kill the bacteria for sure. So they will bring in the lysis of the bacteria, but also they will impart certain characteristic flavor. Okay, so characteristic flavor, and thereby it will impart also the characteristic color, which is pink or red color to the meat as well as meat product, which is highly desirable because the aesthetic appeal of the meat will eventually increase if it appears pink or red in color. So the aesthetic appeal will eventually decrease if it is brown in color. So the brown color in case of meat is effectively because of formation of a significant pigment called as metmyoglobin. Okay, so that is about the nitrates as well as nitrites. One of the possible disadvantage, or it is currently under discussion, is that these nitrates as well as nitrites are bringing in a lot of undesirable changes in case of meat as well as meat products. So currently the use of nitrites as well as nitrates in case of meat as well as meat product to extend the shelf life and to impart aesthetic color as well as flavor to the final product is currently under discussion and debating. Okay, so possibly these are the important chemical agents which are used as a preservative to extend the shelf life of meat as well as meat products. So this was about the chemical preservative. So next thing, we have another important technique called as smoking. So this smoking will also impart certain preservative effect for the meat as well as meat product. So how exactly it is happening? So whenever we are subjecting meat as well as meat product for smoking by using either the normal sawdust or the firewoods, which is the traditional method. Okay, so this will liberate a lot of phenolic compounds, alcohols, organic acids as well as carbonyl compounds and hydrocarbons. So these are the byproducts which are formed as a result of smoking of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the desirable effect of smoking of meat can be the antimicrobial effect. So how exactly antimicrobial effect is imparted? It is exclusively because of aldehydes and the phenols which are liberated as a result of smoking. Okay, and also it will retard the fat oxidation. So that means the rancidity will be effectively avoided. So rancidity is nothing but the hydrolysis of fat. So hydrolysis of fat in here, it is the animal fat is hydrolyzed, which can be in turn prevented by the action of smoking as well. So this is exclusively because of the phenolic as well as aldehyde compounds which are formed. So next then, so the smoking will also have an effect on the tasting, specifically the barbecues which we ideally consume. Okay, so this barbecued meat as well as meat products. So this is exclusively because of phenols, carbonyls as well as other compounds. Okay, so next then we also have attractive color. So this will also impart an attractive color to the final product. So these are the important desirable characteristics which are brought in as far as the smoking of the meat as well as meat product is concerned. Okay, so the next important type of preservation technique can be the addition of antibiotics. So the traditional way of addition of antibiotics, one we have to understand in here is that the addition of the antibiotic to the meat as well as meat product, or directly injecting into an animal, or lending it consume via the other food materials, will eventually has an effect on the preservation activity of the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so whenever we are adding antibiotics at a desirable concentration, they will not have any kind of an effect on the human health. So that means they are basically harmless to human if it is used only in an adequate quantity. Okay, so the broad spectrum antibiotics, so broad spectrum, it is nothing but they can be effective against bacteria, they can be effective against fungi also. Okay, so the broad spectrum antibiotics which are traditionally being used in case of meat as well as meat product includes chlorotetracycline, oxytetracycline and chloramphenicol. So these are the most commonly used traditional antibiotics in case of meat as well as meat product to extend their respective shelf life. Okay, so there has been different methods of infusion of such kind of antibiotics to an animal. So they can be either fed to an animal for a longer duration of time, or prior to slaughtering, or it can be directly injected into an animal carcass after slaughtering, or it can be mixed with the meat as well. So these are the different varieties via which the antibiotics can be added to the meat as well as meat products. So these are the important 8 types of preservation technique that can be effectively employed to ensure the shelf life increment in case of meat as well as meat products. So let us now understand what are all the important spoilage characteristic or the spoilage changes that is brought in by the microorganism in case of meat as well as meat products. So herein we would be majorly concentrating on 5 of the most important types, that is the proteolysis, lipolysis, and the spoilage of meat by aerobic flora and the spoilage of meat by the anaerobic flora. Besides this, we will be also concentrating on putrefaction. Okay, so let us now understand individually. So first thing we have proteolysis. So whenever we are talking about proteolysis, it is nothing but it is the breakdown or the hydrolysis of the protein. So whenever the protein is being hydrolyzed, it means that we effectively require an enzyme. So this particular enzyme called as proteinase is produced by microorganisms. So what kind of microorganism can actually produce? So they can be either psychotropic microflora or they can be thermoduric microflora. So the psychotropic microflora includes Pseudomonas fluorescens, Pseudomonas fragi and microflora which belong to the category of psychotropes. So similarly we have thermoduric microflora which has an ability to produce proteinase as an enzyme. So such as like Micrococcus, Bacillus and Bacillus subtilis as well. Okay, so these are the important category of microorganism which has an ability to produce proteinase as an enzyme. So what exactly happens? So this proteinase will hydrolyze protein into amino acids. So the amino acids that is produced as a byproduct is bitter in taste. So therefore the meat will be imparted with the bitter flavor because of the proteolysis action. So how exactly we can combat this particular problem? By avoiding contamination. That means that we will have to ensure that there is proper asepsis in place, keeping the microorganism away from the food product. So that is avoiding contamination, and also we will have to ensure that there is a controlled storage temperature. That means that there has to be a low temperature storage of meat as well as meat product, thus ensuring that there is no proteolysis in case of meat as well as meat product. So this was about the proteolysis. So the second important type of changes that is brought in by the microorganism is lipolysis. So as the name itself suggests, so it is the lysis of the lipid. So the hydrolysis of the lipid is regarded as lipolysis. So this is also effectively because of an specific type of an enzyme called as lipase. So the lipase will in turn hydrolyze lipid, and thereby it produces free fatty acids. So such free fatty acids in turn imparts characteristic flavor as well as odor to the final product, which are highly undesirable. Okay, so what kind of microorganism can actually produce lipase as an enzyme? So the microorganisms such as belonging to the Pseudomonas species, or it can be the Protease or Micrococcus, and it can be Clostridium and many other variety of yeast as well as mold. So these kind of microorganism has an ability to produce lipase as an enzyme, which in turn breaks down lipid into free fatty acids, in turn imparting undesirable flavor as well as odor, thus resulting in the spoilage of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so this was about the lipolysis. So the next important type is the putrefaction. So whenever we are talking about putrefaction, so one thing we will have to note in here is it is nothing but breakdown of protein in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so in the absence of oxygen, if the protein is broken down or protein is hydrolyzed, it is resulting in the putrefaction. So what are the undesirable changes that is brought in by the putrefaction? So it will result in the formation of the compounds such as like H2S as well as amines. So whenever H2S is produced, it imparts undesirable of odor to the final product. Okay, and therefore the amine also does the same thing. So the breakdown of the protein in an anaerobic environment or in the absence of oxygen will result in a spoilage that is called as putrefaction, which in turn liberates the compounds such as like H2S as well as amines, imparting of odor and flavor to the final product. So how exactly this can be prevented? By ensuring proper asepsis and the chilling of the meat as per the recommendation. And one more important thing that it has to be noted in here is the anaerobic microflora belonging to the Pseudomonas as well as alkali gene species and also the Clostridium are responsible for bringing in putrefaction as an important spoilage in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so next then we have another important type of spoilage, that is general type of spoilage brought in by the aerobic microflora. So this can be divided significantly into three important types. So first one is the surface sliminess, which is exclusively caused by the microorganisms such as like Pseudomonas and then Acinetobacter. And next then we have changes that is exclusively observed in case of meat. So the color changes that is effectively observed, it is, so the red color in case of the meat is regarded as bloom, which is the natural color. So if this natural color of the meat is distorted or deteriorated, it will impart an off color to the final product. So this can be because of the variety of reason, because of the chemical changes as we have discussed previously, which in turn results in the formation of a pigment called as metmyoglobin, which imparts brown color to the final product, which in turn distorts the aesthetic appeal of the meat, and thereby it brings about the undesirable changes in case of meat. Okay, so following which we have another important type, that is phosphorescence. So this particular phosphorescence is caused by phosphorescence or luminescent bacteria called as Photobacterium species. So as it is evidently shown in this particular picture, so the meat will appear shiny. So the blue color shininess that is observed in case this particular meat is exclusively because of the bacteria, that is the Photobacterium species, which in turn brings in the phosphorescence. Okay, so following which we have undesirable discoloration that is effectively observed in case of meat as well as meat products. So if the undesirable yellow color is observed in case of meat, it is effectively because of Flavobacterium as well as Micrococcus species, that is Micrococcus luteus. Okay, so following which we have undesirable blue color which is observed in case of meat as well as meat product, which is brought in by Pseudomonas species, that is syncyanic. Okay, so following which we also have the red color which is effectively brought in by an microorganism, that is a bacteria, that is Serratia marcescens, and also the greenish blue to brown color in case of meat as well as meat product is brought in by a bacteria, that is Chromobacterium lividum. Okay, so these are the undesirable discoloration effectively observed in case of meat as well as meat products. So next then, let us understand what are the general type of spoilages that is brought in by the anaerobic microflora. So that is the microflora which grows effectively in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so the first type of change that is brought in, which is an undesirable change, is stickiness. Okay, so this is exclusively because of numerous growth of surface microflora, that is mold. So if there is numerous growth of microflora or incipient growth of the microflora, then it will result in the stickiness problem which can be observed in case of meat as well as meat products. So similarly, the black spot which is effectively shown in this particular picture. So if black spots is observed on the surface of the meat as well as meat product, it is usually because of the species, that is Cladosporium herbarum. So the Cladosporium herbarum is an effective microorganism which is anaerobic by nature, which results in the black spot on the surface of meat as well as meat product. So similarly, we have white spots which are effectively observed as it is shown in this particular picture. So the white spot that you see in this particular picture is effectively because of the species of species such as like Sporotrichum carnis, and also because of an important fungi, that is Geotrichum species. So they also result in the formation of white spot in case of the surface of the meat. So these are the possible changes that is brought in by the microorganism in case of meat as well as meat products. So in today's lecture, we have effectively understood what is the brief composition of the meat and what can be the effective sources of possible contamination, and also what are the important spoilage characteristics that is observed or brought in by the microorganism, and how effectively they can be combated by employing preservative techniques. So that's all for the day, guys. So I hope this lecture of spoilage of meat and meat product is effectively understood by each and every one of you. Thank you very much.